Hello, this is for class on the 31st of March, and I hope you're getting along all right. I'm fine. I've been working outside as much as I can, and the governor of Maryland today has ordered us to shelter at home, so I'm not going to get out very much. Good thing we can be connected through the internet. You can see I'm in my yellow shirt. I only wear my yellow shirt to weddings, but I decided that I'll wear it for my scopes class. So that's a kind of compliment to how much I like my students. Today we're going to talk about correlational research design. Remember we looked at 4 research designs? We've already gone through experimental and quasi-experiments. We're going to go through correlational research design today, or at least begin it. And the object behind a correlational research design is to look at subjects at one point in time, to study a number of variables on those subjects, and then see what the correlations are among these various variables. The most important correlational research design is the questionnaire or the poll. Uh, and we use that to measure public opinion, and it's become very important. I guess my first question to you is, who pays attention to poll results and why? I'll think about it a second. I would list some of the people that are really interested in polls and questionnaires. First of all, political activists are interested in polls. Maybe on the discussion board, you should try to tell me why you think political activists are interested in this polling kind of research design. Academics, professors, universities are interested in polling. Matter of fact, I was going to give you on your second computer assignment uh, data taken from the American National Election Study done by the University of Michigan. Why do you think professors want to do a poll during every election year? Next, business people, corporations are interested in polling. Why do you think they're interested in it? What do they do with the results of polls? Uh, One of the most important organizations interested in polling are media organizations. I was just looking at a poll today, a CNN poll about the presidential election, Biden versus Mr. Trump, and how they're doing. Almost all the major media organizations, like the New York Times, Washington Post, they conduct polls. Why do you think they do that? What do they get out of it? Finally, the public is interested in polling. I mean, I'm interested as a political scientist, but I'm also interested in polling because I'm a citizen of the United States. Why are citizens interested in polls? Now, these are the organizations that pay attention to polls. I want to talk about the history of polling. How far back does it go? How far back does what we call scientific polling? Uh, Polling that follows a very rigorous method that places a high degree of confidence in its results. How far back can we go with scientific polling? Uh, who was Abraham Lincoln's pollster? You don't know, do you? You don't know because he didn't have one. Polling, and especially scientific polling, goes back about 8 decades. And we can look at the history of polling when we look at how it arose when people were trying to answer questions as to what's going on in politics. And there was, in the 1920s and 1930s, an important magazine called Literary Digest. And their claim to fame is they were going to tell you what was going to happen in an election that was coming up maybe 6 months, 9 months from when they issued their polls. What the Literary Digest did was they had a whole section of their magazine where they kept a database on people's names and addresses, accumulating as many as they could. They got them from phone books. They got them from club memberships. They got them from registration for people's cars. Just like now, you can belong to an organization and they have a whole database of the names, and organizations buy them at so many dollars per name. So the Literary Digest was doing that in the 1920s and 1930s. What they would do is they had 10 million names in their database. That's a pretty big number. They'd mail out ballots to those 10 million people, wait for them to return them, and write up in the Literary Digest what was going on in the election. They sent out, I'm interested in 1936 when they did that, because that's when we begin to get scientific polling. They sent out 10 million of these ballots and they got 2 million back. Now think in your mind. When's the last time you read a poll with 2 million people? And we all know the more people you have in the poll, the better it is. 2 million is a big number. Uh, wouldn't that be good? Doesn't that seem like a good way of trying to figure out who was going to win the election in 1936? Well, who ran for president in 1936? Well, it was Franklin Roosevelt was running for his first re-election race after he won in 1932. And his opponent, I bet many of you don't know who his opponent was. His opponent was the governor of Kansas, Alf Landon. You might know Alf Landon's daughter, Nancy Kassebaum. She was a senator from Kansas. About 10 years ago, she stepped down. So it was Landon versus FDR in the presidential election 1936. The Literary Digest takes in the 2 million ballots, and they predict that Landon's going to win 57% to FDR's 43%. That's a 14% spread. I consider that a landslide. That's a pretty easy Landon victory. However, when the election came out and the results were known, Landon got 38% and FDR got 61%. A landslide. I consider maybe a 10 percentage point difference a landslide. So FDR won a landslide in which the Literary Digest was predicting that that Landon would win the landslide, not FDR. How wrong were they? At the same time this was going on in 1936, there was a man named George Gallup, a young guy just got out of the University of Iowa. He was interested in this same game, but he thought the Literary Digest is not going about this properly. If you want to make a prediction as to what the public is doing in politics, you can't talk to all of them. It's too many people, so you have to have a sample. And what you want to have is, George Gallup begins this idea of you have to have a representative sample. That is, my small sample has to be a subset of what's out there in the larger population. So he did something called a quota sample. He thought, well, if among adults, adult females are 54% of the population and males are 46, in my sample, it should be 54% a female, 46% male. And he looked at, this is the percentage breakdown by race. If blacks are 12% of the population, they should be 12% of my sample. And he looked at rural versus urban living in the United States. We have to mirror those proportions. And then Republicans versus Democrats. He had those proportions. So he filled in and interviewed people so he could fill in all these quotas. And thereby he came to a representative sample that he thought would do better than the Literary Digest. He was so confident that he would do his polls and write up reports and give them out to news organizations with the idea that you'll pay me for my results and my polling, but if I don't beat the Literary Digest, you get your money back. So that was a pretty good idea. He was pretty entrepreneurial about it. And so he did his poll, and he came within 1% of what the actual numbers were. This really put the end of the Literary Digest. It went bankrupt, and it disappeared at that point. And that begins the era of scientific polling by George Gallup in 1936. And this begins scientific polling in the United States. And think, that's 1936, 8 decades ago. Think of the refinements we have had in this way to do research and to do polls and questionnaires. The refinements of the last 8 decades. I would point to, we've had advances in sampling. How do you choose that sample that's representative of the larger group? You can take whole classes on sampling now. We've refined it so much since George Gallup's day. So that's a big advance. We have a big advance in questionnaire construction. What questions did you ask? How do you phrase them? What order do you ask them in? We've been working on that for these 8 decades. We're much better than we were in 1936 at that. We've also worked on statistical analysis. You get all these quantitative data. How do you tease out the meaning and make inferences from these quantitative data? Since that time, there has been a branch of mathematics called statistics. That's become so important, it's like separate departments here at GWU and at other universities. So there's been big advances in statistical technique. Another important advance was computer hardware. There were no computers in 1936. You had to do all this by hand. Now we have computers that will help us analyze and keep all this information with us. Plus, we've had great advances in software. It's too bad that you only had one computer assignment with the software SAS, which is a sophisticated way to analyze quantitative data like this. We've also had an electronic revolution that's placed a telephone in the hands of every American so you can get a hold of people through telephones. And telephone polling is still probably the pretty dominant place. The great mass of people can be contacted through telephone, so you can get a representative sample in that way. So I would say, do you agree with me that polling has become a science? There is such a thing as scientific polling, and that we should place confidence in it. You can comment on any of these things I've been raising on our discussion board under Blackboard. Now, next topic I want to talk about under polling is what I call the theory of polling. And the theory of polling is the reason why, when I see a piece of research based on this research design, it's based on a poll, why do I place any confidence that I've learned something about the world from this piece of research? And in order to do that, I have to assume some of the assumptions in the theory of polling. And I want to go through some of those assumptions, starting with, don't you assume, if you look at a report based upon a poll. I was looking at one today in which President Trump and Vice President Biden are statistically tied in their race for the presidency. I can only place some confidence in that study if, in fact, I will accept the notion that if you want to know people's attitudes and opinions, you ask them, they tell you, you record their responses, and that accurately reflects what they think and what they feel. Well, is that reasonable? I mean, do people tell the truth when they're called up and asked about such things? Uh, there was a journalist in Chicago named Mike Royko. I bet you've never heard of him. Uh, he worked at, I think, the Chicago Tribune, and every year when we get into an election cycle, he would write a column calling on Americans to lie to pollsters. He thought polling is really distorting American politics, and if we all lie to pollsters, it will no longer be a reliable way to find out what people think. That's what he advocated years ago, and it's still the case. I'm looking now at a letter to the editor from 2015 during that election. Somebody in New Hampshire that's saying, this polling is just a plague, it's horrible. So now in New Hampshire, we're thinking, can we pass the word and get people to lie to pollsters? Because then the polling will do no good. People won't pay, say, $50,000 for a poll. And we'll be rid of this plague. Pardon my use of the word plague under these circumstances. Do you think people lie to pollsters? I think for the most part, they probably do not. Under usual circumstances. There are some circumstances in which it's harder to get the truth from people, certain topics that maybe they don't tell the truth on. So, for instance, a sensitive topic like sex, you think when a stranger calls you and asks you about your sex life, that you can get reliable information from them. Or drugs. Do you think someone can call you on the phone and say, how many times last month did you take cocaine? And people give you an answer and you think that answer is accurate. And there are other areas. But what we've done as researchers is we found there are these topics that are sensitive and we work around it. Like we wanted to know about people's sex life in the United States during the 1980s when AIDS was going around, because people came to the conclusion that one of the ways to spread AIDS was through people's sexual behavior. Well, government, National Institute of Drug Abuse, and places like that want to know, in fact, what are people's sexual behavior? And so the research organization at the University of Chicago did a detailed study on people's sex life, and they came up with techniques that there are certain sensitive topics in sex that it's best if you get people to answer it by questionnaire and they write their answers rather than a face-to-face kind of interview. Or drugs. National Institute of Drug Abuse wants to know about people's drug use in the United States. When I was a PhD student, I worked doing the SAS runs for a research organization here at George Washington University. We wanted to know what percentage of Americans are taking cocaine? Well, we thought if you just call people up and ask them, their answers probably are not reliable. So this is the technique we used. We paid the Gallup organizations money to put questions on their questionnaire that they ask every month. And what we did is we had, when Gallup would call somebody up, 1,500 people were put in Group A and 1,500 people in Group B. And we asked, say, Group A, we asked them this: how many of these risky things have you done the last 3 months? Drove a car over 80 miles an hour, parachuted from an airplane, had sex without a condom. Everybody put 0 if they did none of them, 3 if they did all 3 of them. Who's doing all 3 of those things? And so that's Group A. Group B, they're randomly chosen, and they get a question that says, how many of these dangerous things have you done the last 3 months? Drove the car over 80, parachuted from an airplane, had sex without a condom, took cocaine. So see, we've added that 4th possibility, take cocaine. And then think in your minds, what if no one is taking cocaine in the United States? And we look at the mean on that question from Group A and Group B, the means will be the same, won't they? Because no one's ticked up 1 notch by taking the cocaine, because no one is taking cocaine in the group. What if everybody in the group took cocaine? That those means, when we compare them, that Group B mean will be 1 point higher. So we were able to ask that question, get the mean, and then subtract the mean of Group A from Group B, and that gave us the proportion of Americans that took cocaine. Interesting kind of study. Sensitive topic. People might not tell the truth, but we get around it. We work around it. Now, another assumption of polling. We assume if we think we can rely on research based upon polling, that pollsters have accurately measured opinions and attitudes with a reliable, valid measuring instrument. That is, you have to have a good, positive questionnaire. Well, is that assumption unreasonable or reasonable? Well, it depends on the pollsters. Some polls are done because they put a certain spin on the question. They want certain results to bring to members of Congress to say, look, at all these people feel this way, you want to vote in such and such a way. But a reliable, good pollster that's paying good money like Gallup is not going to spin questions like that. And you can assume, when you have a real professional pollster, that they've studied these questions very hard and they're not trying to bias the answers this way or that way. A third assumption for polling, in this theory of polling. When you look at that poll, you think that the pollsters' report are honest and objective. You got to believe that. And well, that is called into question when you look at most professional pollsters. They're usually a Democratic pollster, like, say, Celinda Lake, or a Republican pollster, like Frank Luntz. The partisan parties have their own pollsters, and you have to think, are they really being objective and honest about this? This came up as an issue to me in the election of 1994. I watched on Sunday before the election the Sunday talk shows, and for David Brinkley's show, they had Celinda Lake, the Democratic pollster, well known, and Frank Luntz, the Republican pollster, well known. And I watched them. They're going to talk about what's supposed to happen in 2 days on Election Day, on Tuesday. And Celinda Lake said that the Republicans will gain 2 seats in the Senate. Frank Luntz says they're going to gain 6. How could they have this difference? They're scientific pollsters. Is there a bias involved in that? And wouldn't you know, and I'm talking about it with my class that week, one of the girls raised her hand and said, well, I've been dating Frank Luntz, one of the pollsters. And I said, well, good. Tell us what's going on. And she said that the pollsters have great pressure from their parties to, when they're in public, make the party look good and keep people going. But once they're not before the cameras, once they're in the back talking honestly with people, they give the honest answers under those circumstances. So it depends upon the situation for the pollster. Now, a way to get around this is to have a pollster done by 2 pollsters, one a Democratic pollster and one a Republican pollster, so they can't cancel out each other's bias. A 4th assumption of polling: you assume that the respondents who are interviewed are a representative sample, and their responses can be generalized to a larger population from which they've been drawn. Do you believe that's the case? Do you believe you can take 1,200 people and make inferences to 350 million people based upon those 1,200 people? Well, it depends upon how you choose the 1,200 people. If you do it in a scientific way, you've got that sample. The theory of sampling is you can make that inference. And some people tell me, I don't think you can make a judgment about 350 million people based upon 1,200 people. And well, what I ask them is, well, when I went to the doctors last month, they wanted to see my blood chemistry, cholesterol, and that. And the guy shoves the needle in my arm, and he takes a little bit like this, and from that, he makes inferences to all the blood flowing through my body. If I were such a skeptic about sampling, I would have told the technician, no, take it all out. I want an actual reading of what my blood chemistry is like. That is that idea of a sample and how it works. What we'll talk about in the next video that I'm going to send you for the next class is how do we draw these various samples? What are the strengths and the weakness of different kind of samples? That's what we'll do next time. Now, I would go to the discussion board that we have on your Blackboard and answer some of the questions I've asked. Ask your own questions. And I hope you're doing fine where you're at. Adios.